Welcome to our deep dive today. I know you guys are all pretty familiar with economics already, but we're going to be looking at it from a kind of different angle today. We're going to be looking at it through the lens of physics.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so our guide for this journey is going to be a paper called A Brief History of Economics, an Outsider's Account by Bikas K. Chakraborty.
Interesting.
Yeah, and we're going to be tracing how physics principles and methodologies have subtly and sometimes not so subtly influenced economic thought, over the centuries.
Yeah, that's a fascinating connection. It's interesting to think about how economics as a formal discipline, really emerged much later than physics.
Right.
And what Chakrabarty highlights in this paper is that even the earliest economic models, like those proposed by the physiocrats back in the 18th century, they drew inspiration from physics, which was, the more established field at the time.
Right. Yeah, the physiocrats are a really interesting starting point, I think, because they view the economy as analogous to the human body, with different sectors operating like organs,
Interesting.
all working in harmony to maintain a healthy system.
Ah, like a well-oiled machine, kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They even use this analogy to justify things like rent and taxes, arguing that these were essential for the well-being of this economic body.
It's a very organic way of looking at it.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Although, while that direct physiological analogy might have had its limitations, I think, it does really underscore that early influence of a scientific, almost like a mechanistic approach to understanding these economic systems.
Right.
And this was further developed by the mercantilists, who brought a really crucial empirical observation to the table:
Yeah.
the link between trade deficits and economic downturns.
Yeah, so the mercantilists, they noticed that when a country imports significantly more than it exports, it often coincides with periods of, economic instability and unemployment.
Okay.
And this led them to the concept of effective demand, which
Yeah.
basically argues that for an economy to thrive, there needs to be sufficient demand to absorb the goods and services that are being produced.
And, that observation had some pretty profound consequences.
Yeah.
It suggested that the actions of individual economic agents, the people, the businesses,
Right.
could actually have unintended negative consequences for the economy as a whole. And that was a big deal.
Yeah.
Because this realization really challenged the prevailing laissez-faire ideology of the time.
Right.
And it opened the door for the idea of government intervention in the economy, like imposing tariffs on imports to protect domestic industries and things like that.
Right. Yeah, to try to stimulate demand.
Exactly.
So now, alongside these developments, we have Thomas Malthus entering the scene
Ah, yes.
with his rather pessimistic predictions about population growth.
Right. Malthus, his work, it really stands out because he was one of the first to introduce mathematical rigor to economic analysis. He used concepts like arithmetic and geometric progressions to model the relationship between population growth and agricultural production.
So he was bringing in tools from math, essentially,
Right.
to try to analyze these trends.
Exactly. And his conclusion, well, it was a bit stark. He argued that population tends to grow geometrically, while food production can only increase arithmetically.
Right?
And this, he argued, would inevitably lead to resource scarcity, famine, and these cycles of hardship.
Yeah, a rather bleak outlook,
Yeah, a bit of a downer.
to be sure. But what's important is that he was applying these mathematical tools, borrowed from physics, to analyze and predict these economic trends. And this, really foreshadows a trend that becomes much more pronounced later on.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, we can't talk about this period without mentioning Adam Smith
Right.
and his revolutionary concept of the invisible hand.
Right, the invisible hand.
Yeah.
So Smith argued that in a free market, individuals pursuing their own self-interest would unintentionally create a system that benefits society as a whole.
Yes, prices would adjust, resources would be allocated efficiently, and the overall wealth of the nation would increase. It's a really powerful idea.
It is, and what's really remarkable is that this idea of a self-organizing system where order and efficiency emerge from the seemingly chaotic actions of individuals was really ahead of its time.
Oh, absolutely. It foreshadowed similar concepts that would appear later in physics and chemistry.
Yeah.
Things like the self-assembly of molecules,
Right.
or the formation of complex patterns in those dissipative systems.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
It really is. And Smith, he didn't have the benefit of these later scientific discoveries,
Right.
but he was essentially proposing a kind of economic natural selection. That in a competitive market, efficient producers and beneficial practices would naturally thrive, while inefficient ones would just be weeded out,
Right.
leading to a more robust and prosperous economy overall.
So in the 18th century, what we're seeing is like the birth of economics as a distinct field of study, heavily influenced by, the scientific and mathematical thinking of the time.
Exactly.
But the real drama unfolds in the 19th century as economists start grappling with these fundamental questions about the very nature of value and price.
Right. This period is marked by the emergence of the labor theory of value,
Okay.
championed by thinkers like David Ricardo and Karl Marx. The central tenet of this theory is that the value of a commodity is directly proportional to the amount of labor required to produce it.
Okay.
It's a simple idea
Yeah.
and intuitively appealing, but it runs into some significant challenges.
So like what kind of challenges?
Well, the classic example is the diamond water paradox.
Yeah, right.
Water, essential for life,
Yeah.
requires significant labor to purify and distribute,
Of course.
yet it's relatively cheap.
Right.
Diamonds, on the other hand, far less essential, but command these exorbitant prices,
Yeah.
even though the labor involved in mining and cutting them might be comparable.
Right. So the labor theory of value kind of breaks down there.
Yeah, it does. This paradox exposed a fundamental flaw in the labor theory of value. It failed to account for factors like scarcity, demand, and most importantly, the subjective value that consumers place on different goods.
Okay.
And the resolution to this paradox came from the development of the concept of marginal utility.
Right.
And this is where the Austrian School of Economics, with figures like Karl Menger and William Stanley Jevons, comes into play.
Okay, so how do they address this issue?
Well, they realized that it wasn't the total utility of a good that determined its price, but rather the additional satisfaction. The marginal utility gained from consuming one more unit of it.
I think.
So water, while essential, is generally abundant.
All right.
So the marginal utility of an additional glass of water is relatively low, hence the low price.
Right.
Diamonds being scarce have a high marginal utility even for those who already possess many, and that explains their high price.
So that explains the diamond water paradox.
Exactly. This concept of marginal utility was a crucial step forward, but it created new challenges. Economists now needed more sophisticated tools to represent this complex interplay of supply, demand, and individual preferences in determining prices.
Right, because it's not just about the labor that goes into it.
Exactly. And this is where the influence of physics becomes even more pronounced.
Okay.
Economists began to realize that to truly advance their understanding, they needed to embrace the rigor and precision of mathematics.
Okay.
They needed a language that could capture the dynamic and often counterintuitive behavior of economic systems.
Right. It's not always straightforward.
No, it's not.
So this brings us to the dawn of the 20th century,
Yes.
where the drive towards formalization and mathematical modeling really takes center stage.
Right. This period is marked by the rise of neoclassical economics, spearheaded by figures like Leon Walras and Alfred Marshall. Walras, he made significant strides in applying mathematical models to economic systems. He developed the concept of general equilibrium, where the prices of all goods and services are determined simultaneously through a system of interconnected equations.
Wow.
It was an attempt to create a comprehensive model of the economy, akin to like a unified field theory in physics.
So he was trying to find like the underlying equations that governed all these economic interactions.
Precisely. And Marshall, while sharing Walras's emphasis on mathematical rigor, focused more on the practical application of economic theory to real-world problems.
Okay.
He refined the concepts of supply and demand, developed tools for analyzing market equilibrium, really practical stuff.
Right, so bringing those theoretical ideas down to earth.
Exactly.
But of course, the real world rarely conforms to the neat, predictable models of classical economics.
That's very true.
And the Great Depression of the 1930s was like this stark reminder that economic systems can be inherently unstable.
Oh, absolutely.
And prone to these sudden catastrophic downturns.
Yeah. And this is where John Maynard Keynes enters the picture. Right. Challenging that prevailing laissez-faire ideology and arguing for a more active role for government in managing the economy.
So Keynes was really a game changer.
He was. His work was groundbreaking in several respects. He argued that the classical model, with its emphasis on market self-correction, failed to account for these prolonged periods of economic downturn.
Right.
He believed that the problem wasn't a lack of supply, but rather a deficiency in aggregate demand.
Okay.
People simply weren't spending enough money to keep the economy running at full capacity.
I see.
And so his solution was a radical departure from classical economics. He advocated for government intervention, particularly through fiscal policy,
Right.
increasing government spending, cutting taxes to stimulate demand and jumpstart the economy.
So this is what we know as Keynesian economics.
Exactly. And it had a profound impact on economic policy in the decades following the Great Depression.
Right.
But Keynesian economics, while influential, wasn't without its critics and limitations.
Of course.
As we move into the mid-20th century, we see a resurgence of interest in these microeconomic foundations and a renewed focus on the mathematical modeling of individual economic behavior.
Okay.
And this is where some of the less well-known but incredibly important observations start to emerge, and where the influence of physics takes on these even more nuanced forms.
Okay.
So let's delve into those in our next segment.
As we move deeper into the 20th century, we encounter a fascinating figure whose work, the often overlooked, really laid the groundwork for many of the ideas that would later blossom into econophysics.
Yeah.
Talking about Vilfredo Pareto.
Pareto, yes. His contribution was really significant, particularly his observations on wealth distribution.
Right.
You know, he found that wealth wasn't distributed evenly across society, as one might expect if it were purely random.
Right.
Instead, it followed what we now call a power law distribution, meaning there are far fewer extremely wealthy individuals than a normal distribution would predict.
So his findings were really groundbreaking because they challenged that assumption that over time, wealth would become more evenly spread.
Yeah.
And so Pareto's work was like a crucial first step towards understanding the dynamics of wealth and income inequality, a
Right.
problem that continues to plague societies even today.
Absolutely. And what's particularly interesting is that Pareto's observations mirrored patterns found in other seemingly unrelated fields.
Huh.
For instance, the distribution of city sizes or the frequency of word usage in a language. They also tend to follow power laws. So this suggests a deeper underlying principle at work,
Right.
something that transcended specific disciplines.
It's almost as if there's this universal mathematical structure governing the distribution of resources,
Yeah.
whether it's wealth in an economy or population in cities or even words in a language.
Exactly.
And speaking of these unexpected connections, we can't forget Louis Bachelier and his pioneering work on price fluctuations in the stock market.
Bachelier, yes. His contribution is particularly intriguing because he applied the concept of random walk to model those stock price movements.
Okay.
And this was decades before Albert Einstein formalized this concept in his work on Brownian motion.
Wow.
So it was, in essence, an early application of statistical physics to the financial markets,
Right.
long before the term econophysics even existed.
So we're seeing these threads of connection between physics and economics weaving together, even in the early 20th century.
Yes.
It's as if the tools and concepts of physics were almost unconsciously being drawn towards the complex and often perplexing behavior of economic systems.
And as we move into the latter half of the 20th century, these connections become even more explicit.
Okay.
Economists like Paul Samuelson and Jan Tinbergen, they began incorporating these physics-inspired approaches into their work,
Okay.
pushing the field towards greater mathematical rigor and sophistication.
So Samuelson, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1970, he applied concepts from classical mechanics to investigate the dynamic stability of economic systems.
That's right. He was creating dynamic models that could capture how supply and demand interact over time,
Right.
leading to either a stable equilibrium or potentially chaotic fluctuations.
Wow.
And he used differential equations similar to those used to describe the motion of objects in physics to model the evolution of economic variables.
So really bringing in those physics tools directly.
Exactly. And then you have Tinbergen, who received the first ever Nobel Prize in economics in 1969.
Wow, the first one.
Yeah, he was a pioneer in econometrics, using statistical methods to analyze economic data.
Okay.
And his background as a physicist gave him unique insights into how to handle those complex data sets and model economic phenomena, like business cycles, the cyclical booms and busts that economies experience.
So their work, along with the contributions of other Nobel laureates like Kenneth Arrow in general equilibrium theory,
Yes.
George Stigler in price theory, and John Nash in game theory
Hmm.
really solidified the role of mathematics in economics.
Yeah.
So by the late 20th century, it was clear that mathematical tools and concepts from physics were becoming increasingly accepted within mainstream economics.
They were.
But what made econophysics distinct?
No.
Was it simply a natural progression, or was there something more to this emerging field?
Econophysics, while building on these earlier developments, brought a new perspective to the table.
Okay.
It wasn't just about applying existing physics tools to economic problems.
Right.
It was about recognizing that certain economic phenomena might exhibit behaviors analogous to physical systems,
Oh.
suggesting these deeper underlying principles at play.
So like what, for example?
One of the most compelling examples of this is the work of Benoit Mandelbrot on market fluctuation.
Okay.
He challenged the traditional assumption that price changes in financial markets followed a normal bell-shaped Gaussian distribution.
Okay.
Instead, he found that they exhibited fat tails, meaning extreme price swings, the so-called black swan events,
Right.
were far more frequent than predicted by standard statistical models. And Mandelbrot drew parallels with physical systems that exhibit similar behaviors, such as turbulent flows or earthquakes,
Wow.
where small initial disturbances can cascade into these large-scale, unpredictable events.
So he was saying that there are these similarities in the way that these systems behave.
Exactly. And his work, along with the development of chaos theory and complex systems research in physics, provided a new framework for understanding the inherent instability and potential for sudden dramatic shifts
Right.
in complex systems, including financial markets.
So econophysics was not only challenging existing economic models,
Right.
but also proposing these new ways of thinking about risk uncertainty and the potential for systemic breakdowns.
Exactly. And the availability of massive amounts of economic data, particularly from financial markets, really fueled this new way of thinking. Physicists, with their expertise in data analysis and complex systems modeling, were well equipped to dive into the sea of information and search for patterns that might have been overlooked by traditional economists.
Right. They had the tools and the mindset.
Precisely. And from this fertile ground emerged two major modeling efforts within econophysics: the minority game and models of income and wealth distribution.
Okay, let's start with the minority game.
Okay, so the minority game, developed by physicists like Brian Arthur, Damien Chalet, and Yicheng Zhang, was a novel attempt to model the behavior of agents in financial markets using concepts from game theory and statistical mechanics.
Okay.
It challenged the traditional economic assumption of rational agents with perfect information.
Right, because in the real world, people don't always have all the information.
Exactly. Instead of assuming perfect rationality, the minority game acknowledged that people often act on limited information influenced by herd behavior and even intuition.
Okay, so they're bringing in like the human element.
Yeah, it also incorporated the idea of learning and adaptation, where agents adjust their strategies based on past outcomes.
So they're learning from their mistakes.
Right, and the beauty of this model is that it demonstrated how complex and seemingly unpredictable market behavior can emerge from the interactions of a large number of agents, each following relatively simple rules.
So it's almost like taking Adam Smith's invisible hand concept and injecting it with a dose of real-world complexity.
Exactly, instead of a smooth, predictable equilibrium.
Right.
The minority game often resulted in these dynamic, fluctuating outcomes,
Yeah.
much more in line with what we observe in actual markets.
That makes sense. And then we have the efforts to model income and wealth distribution, a problem that has vexed economists for
It's a
centuries.
perennial problem.
This area of econophysics draws heavily on concepts from statistical physics,
Yes.
particularly the Boltzmann-Gibbs distribution,
Right.
which describes how energy is distributed among particles in a system.
It might sound strange,
Yeah, a little bit.
but there are some intriguing parallels between the distribution of wealth in a society
Oh.
and the distribution of energy in a physical system.
Huh.
Traditional economic models often struggle to explain the observed patterns of income and wealth inequality, particularly the fact that a small percentage of the population tends to hold a disproportionately large share of the wealth.
So how does the Boltzmann-Gibbs distribution help explain this?
Well, under certain conditions, the distribution of wealth in a society can resemble the distribution of energy particles in a gas,
Okay.
with a few individuals possessing a large amount of economic energy and the majority having much less.
So econophysicists are proposing that the extreme concentration of wealth we see might not be entirely due to factors like individual talent or effort.
Yeah,
but could in part be an emergent property of the economic system itself,
precisely.
just as the distribution of energy in a physical system is governed by the laws of thermodynamics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Of course, this is a simplified analogy, and there are many factors contributing to wealth inequality.
Right.
But the use of statistical physics models has opened up these new avenues for exploring this complex issue.
So it's giving us new ways to think about it.
It is, and it's this willingness to challenge conventional economic thinking to apply tools and concepts from other disciplines that lies at the heart of econophysics.
Very interdisciplinary.
It is, but the question remains, has
Yeah.
this new approach been embraced by the wider economics community?
Right.
Or is it still viewed with skepticism? We'll
Yeah.
delve into that in our final segment.
We've seen how econophysics has emerged as this fascinating blend of physics and economics, challenging traditional models and offering fresh perspectives on these complex economic phenomena. But the big question looming over all of this is, where does econophysics stand today?
Yeah.
Has it gained acceptance within the broader economics community,
Right.
or is it still met with resistance?
That's the crux of the matter. And the answer, as with most things in academia, is nuanced. Within the physics community, econophysics has undoubtedly gained significant traction.
Okay.
We're seeing a surge in publications in physics journals on econophysics topics,
Yep.
and more universities are offering courses on this interdisciplinary field. So this suggests a growing recognition within physics of its potential to contribute to our understanding of economic systems.
So it seems to be finding a comfortable home within physics departments.
It does.
But what about economics departments?
Right.
Are they welcoming this influx of ideas from the physics world?
Well, that's where things get a bit more complicated. While some economists, particularly those open to these interdisciplinary approaches, have embraced the insights from econophysics, there's also a palpable sense of skepticism, even resistance from certain segments of the economics community.
Why is that? What are some of the main criticisms leveled against econophysics by more traditional economists?
One of the most common criticisms is that econophysics models often oversimplify the complexities of human behavior.
Okay.
Economists argue that people are not like particles in a gas behaving according to predictable physical laws.
Right.
Humans are driven by emotions biases and often irrational motivations that are difficult, if not impossible, to capture in these neat mathematical equations.
So there's a concern that by trying to shoehorn human behavior into these physics-based models, econophysicists might be sacrificing the nuance and richness of real-world economic decision-making.
That's the worry.
Mm.
Another critique is that while econophysics excels at identifying patterns in data, it sometimes fails to adequately account for the historical, social, and political contexts that shape those patterns. The concern is that econophysics models can become a bit like black boxes.
Oh.
You feed in data, get out results, but without a deep understanding of the underlying causal mechanisms.
Right, so there are limitations to the approach.
There are.
It sounds like there's this fundamental tension between the physicist's quest for universal, elegant laws and the economist's recognition of the messy, contingent nature of human systems.
Yeah, that's a very astute observation, and this tension lies at the heart of the debate about the future of econophysics. Will it succeed in bridging this gap, becoming an integral part of economics, enriching and expanding the field's analytical toolkit?
Yeah.
Or will it remain a somewhat isolated niche within physics, offering intriguing insights but ultimately failing to reshape the mainstream of economic thought?
So the jury is still out.
It is.
But the very fact that this debate is happening is a testament to the intellectual ferments that econophysics has sparked.
Absolutely.
It's forcing both physicists and economists to confront their assumptions, to re-examine their methods, and to consider these new ways of approaching complex problems.
And that in itself is a valuable contribution. The cross-pollination of ideas, even when it leads to vigorous disagreement, can be a powerful catalyst for progress. It pushes both fields to refine their thinking, to sharpen their arguments, and to strive for a deepened understanding.
This deep dive has been a fascinating journey, revealing the hidden connections between physics and economics, from the earliest economic models to the emergence of econophysics as a distinct field. We see how the tools and concepts of physics have subtly and sometimes not so subtly influenced economic thought throughout history.
And as we stand at this crossroads, the future of econophysics remains an open question.
Yeah.
Will it revolutionize economics, offering a new paradigm for understanding these complex economic systems?
Right.
Or will it fade into obscurity, a fascinating intellectual detour, but ultimately a dead end? Only time will tell.
But one thing is certain. The questions that econophysics is grappling with, questions about inequality, market instability, the very nature of value, are questions that we as a society must confront.
We must.
And the tools and perspectives that econophysics offers, even if they don't provide all the answers, can help us to ask better questions, to challenge our assumptions, and to search for new and more effective solutions.
For those of you listening, if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to explore Bikas Chakrabarty's paper and delve deeper into the world of econophysics. It's a field ripe for exploration, with the potential to yield profound insights into the workings of our complex economic world.
Thank you for joining us on this intellectual adventure. We hope it has challenged your thinking and inspired you to continue exploring the intersections between these seemingly disparate yet deeply interconnected fields.